Hi, everyone. This is Andrew,
And this is Laura.
and you're listening to Sunday School Dropouts. Today, we are going to talk about the nervous system, what it is, why it's important to trauma, and even more importantly, why it's important for healing.
Yes, I'm so excited for this. But before we start, let's jump into some flannel graph story time. For those of you who don't know, flannel graph story time is our opportunity to share with you what we are reading, listening to, the things that we're kind of learning from. So, Andrew, share with us what's going on for you. What are you reading, listening to? What's been influential for you?
Yeah. So recently, other folks maybe have already known about this podcast for forever, so my apologies, but I've discovered a podcast called The Influence Continuum.
Yes.
It is created by Dr. Stephen Hassan, who's done a lot
Mm-hmm.
of work on cults.
Yes.
He's created a model called the bite model, and he's just done a lot of research on cults, how they operate, the psychology behind how they operate. Really useful resource. All of that to say that now what finally got me to listen to the podcast. I actually hadn't heard of it before, but I saw he interviewed a gentleman who was a former Seventh-day Adventist, which for those who don't
Yeah.
know, that's my
Yeah.
denomination of origin. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it's kind of taken me down a bit of a rabbit trail. When I left Adventism, I didn't really leave Adventism. I actually kind of just left Christianity. And what I mean by that is, in
Yeah.
terms of deconstruction or whatever term you want to use, I didn't really do anything with Adventism. I just left the whole damn thing, meaning Christianity
Mm-hmm.
altogether.
Yeah.
But after listening to the interview that Dr. Hassan did with, I think it was Dr. Steve Daly, I believe was his name,
Mm.
and he's a psychologist among other things, but he's formerly a Seventh-day Adventist pastor and all of that. Um, really got me interested and actually kind of deep diving some of the stuff with like Ellen White, for example, who is the prophet and
Okay.
founder of the church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church,
Gotcha.
and some other big figures of the church and of that entire movement, and just realizing how corrupt feels like such a strong word, but I guess for lack of a
Mm.
better word, how corrupt and how sketchy some of those things were. Anyway,
Wow.
all of that to say
Yeah.
that it's interesting going back to this because these are things that I didn't really realize I'd avoided
Yeah.
until
Mm-hmm.
recently. So
Yeah.
it's been rewarding. It's been fun too. You know.
Yeah.
So.
Do you feel like is it like, oh, I have these other areas that I need to kind of untangle and deconstruct, or is it just kind of, I don't know, revisiting old stuff to like make sure you don't believe it anymore? Or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, maybe a little bit of both, but kind of
Mm.
that initial part, I feel like it's just kind of unfinished business. There's some baggage there
Yeah.
that I feel like instead of really processing and coming to any sort of closure, I just sort of left it. And
Yeah.
then I used, it wasn't an excuse, but I used the fact that I kind of just had left Christianity completely. It's like, well, if I
Mm-hmm.
left Christianity, I can by default leave Adventism and I don't really have to look at it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have to look at it, but there definitely was some
Mm-hmm.
unfinished business there. I'll say it that way.
Yeah.
And so, even though I am out of Christianity, I currently have zero intention of going back.
Yeah.
There's still things within Adventism specifically that I
Yeah.
kind of feel like I kind of want to go back and really look at and scrutinize and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So
Yeah.
because that's something I realized I did not do. And it's not that I have to do it, but
Yeah.
I definitely recognize that, over the last decade, as I was leaving Adventism, it's kind of like I didn't want to bad mouth Adventism because
Yeah.
the thing that they always would say about those who left and critiques the church is, oh, they're just bitter. They had a bad experience. Now
Mm.
they're just bitter and they're out to just undermine the church and God's remnant and all this other bullshit.
Mm.
And so I was thinking and subconsciously thinking, well, I don't want to be that. So I'll just conveniently dismiss Christianity altogether. It's not personal Adventism. It's Christianity as a whole
Mm.
that I have an issue with. And now it's
Yeah.
like, I don't have anything for Christianity anymore, particularly. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, I also feel like there's something specific to Adventism I need to go back and unpack.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'm starting to do that. And that
Yeah.
podcast and Dr. Steve Daly, who was the
Mm-hmm.
former Adventist, I am actually
Mm-hmm.
starting to really kind of dive into some of their work and
Yeah.
work on some of that.
I love that. I think I mean, I know in a future episode, we're going to talk about deconstruction and, kind of what that actually is. But I think, what you're hitting on there is I really resonate with that of like this process of deconstruction, that it's not necessarily like I do this thing for a certain amount of time. I deconstruct my late beliefs for 6 months, for a year, 2 years, whatever, and then I'm done. Right. Like
Mhm.
it's like, no, there's other things that come up. And I can resonate because I came from that Reformed theology background. So when I rejected all of that, I was like, I don't need to or want to go back to that stuff. Like I don't believe it. Right. And yet when you actually do dig into it, you're like, God, like the messages that were taught are so, I mean, embodied. It's like I think about the message of like, you're not worthy, right? You're
Mm.
born evil. And when you're
Yeah.
taught that from as long as you can remember, like, yes, it's one thing to reject it and say, like, I'm done with that, but it shows up in your life all over the place, it just in a really embodied way. And so I can really resonate with what you're kind of going through now of like, oh, I've got to go back and look at some of these messages that were maybe more specific to Adventism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, it's funny. The word cult is such a heavy word, such a loaded
Yeah.
word. And so
Yeah.
part of me has sort of actually defended Adventism. Like, yeah, it's
Mm,
fundamentalist, it's harmful, but it's not a
yeah.
cult. And now
Yeah.
I'm actually going into some of the origins of what founded the denomination. And I'm like, yeah, actually that's pretty fucking culty.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow. Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that's a cult. That's the definition
Okay.
of a cult.
That's really interesting. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'm so
Yeah.
excited to hear
Yeah.
like the more that you're like learning because I think it's fascinating
Yeah.
to hear about.
Well,
So,
y'all
yeah.
will get to hear it in real time because I'm sure I'll bring it up
Love
again.
it. I love
Yeah. But
it.
yeah. But Laura,
Hmm.
I'm curious, what are some things you're reading or listening to lately?
Yeah. So I am okay. The book is like, okay, what have I been reading? Because I'm usually reading like 4 or 5 books at a time. Um, I'm listening to some, whatever. So the book that I'm reading right now is called Maybe You Should Talk to Somebody by Lori Gottlieb. She's a therapist. I really like the book because there is, I mean, similar to how you and I operate, like there's the personal side and the professional side. She does a really good job of mixing them together. And she shares like different client stories, obviously no identities, but then her own process of going to therapy and navigating through the grief of a relationship. And it's just really been interesting. I think sometimes therapists are they're not above therapy. Most of us know that. but people talking about therapists going to therapy, like not many people do that. It's like, oh, do I really want to hear about my therapist's issues that they're seeing their therapist for? And so it really is like normalizing that extra piece of the process. I'm only about halfway into it, but I've really appreciated learning from her. I've read some of her books in the past and she's got just like kind of like no nonsense. What I like about her is without her knowing this or maybe like intending this, I think a lot of the ideas that she talks about in regard to relationships and just life and stuff are very opposite of like what was taught in fundamentalism and purity culture. So like she's got a book on relationships and I'm like, wow, like I probably needed to read this coming out of purity culture, just like for a different way of thinking about relationships. I really appreciate that. But then I was also thinking like, what am I listening to? And maybe it's just because I'm getting older, the grays are coming in. But I'm listening to the Julia Louis Dreyfus's new podcast, which I'm like, oh God, what's it called? I think it's called Wiser Than Me. And it's this really incredible podcast. Of course, I'm looking it up here. Yeah, Wiser Than Me with Julia Louis Dreyfus. And she just talks with women who are older than her. So she's in her 60s. And so she talks with women who are in decades older than her to learn from them and just, like find out, like, teach me what do I need to know? What's it like to, go through life in these different ways? And I really find so much value in that, like the wisdom, not only of other people, but just like generationally. I
Mhm.
think that's one of the things I do miss from religion is, there's not many contexts that we have where there's like multiple generations, like in one room, where you have the opportunity to learn from people younger than you, same life stage, older than you. So I've really enjoyed this podcast because I feel like I'm back in that space of like being able to like learn from women who are older than me. Like my grandmothers are both deceased. And so I don't get to learn from them anymore. I can look back at their lives and learn from them, but like, it's just, I really like having those older generations, almost to just give you perspective on like, you know what, don't worry about that. Like, just, keep going after what you're passionate about. I think I need to be reminded of that. So that's where I've been at the last little bit here. That's what I've been, it's been what's on my flannel graph storyboard.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of reminded how so many folks tell me how community is one of the biggest things they miss after
Yeah.
having left church, whatever
Yeah,
church
for
that may be.
sure.
And so, yeah, just what you
Mhm.
said about the intergenerational piece and not
Yeah.
many contexts where you get those different generations all within the same room. And it's just, I
Mhm.
don't know, that's really cool. Because, yeah, it makes me think
Yeah.
of that, what folks have said, how the community is
Mhm.
just sort of a thing that they really grieve.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I love that there's, with social media and podcasts and things like that, it's like we can replace tiny parts of that, the community, the generational stuff. So I'm going to keep listening. There is some fabulous women out there. So I love it.
No, it sounds great. Sounds
Yeah.
great.
All right, everybody. Are we ready to take on some prayer requests today? As most of you know, the dearly beloved, just kidding, Pat Robertson died a week ago or so?
Yeah,
2 weeks
yeah,
ago. I can't remember,
actually,
beginning of June.
I think it may have actually been exactly a week ago,
Yeah.
plus or minus a
Beginning of
day. Yeah.
beginning of Pride Month. How ironic. So, because of that, we thought we would take a little time during our prayer requests to talk about old Pat Robertson. So, Andrew, go ahead, share with us what's on your heart.
Uh, you know, I mean, good riddance is on my heart. Um, but I suppose to be fair, this does open up a conversation about celebrating somebody's death.
Yes, that's
That's
exactly
been
what I've been thinking.
it's
Yes.
been all over
Mhm,
social media. There's been
mhm,
some really interesting Twitter threads about it. I don't know where you fall on this whole thing. My thought is that not only just Pat himself, but the ideology that he
mhm.
espoused, and then just the way he enabled and perpetuated so many like Christian ideology, but there's politics in general that
Mhm.
were very much, especially in light of just all of the anti-gay, and especially
Oh yeah.
anti-trans legislation that is
Yeah.
currently being passed and is pending in a lot of different state legislatures right now.
Mhm.
It just the gravity of what he stood for and the kinds of things he said.
Yeah.
It's not just about Pat Robertson. It's bigger than Pat Robertson, but I feel like the
Yeah.
fact of the matter is, the world is a slightly better place with him out of it. Maybe not even slightly. The world is a much better place with people like that not
Yeah.
continuing to be able to
Mhm.
spread their hate. And so,
Mhm. Mhm.
do I inherently celebrate somebody dying? No, but I do celebrate
Yeah.
one less harmful voice spewing its venom out into, well, now in this
Mhm.
day and age, out into social media and the internet.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at on it. I mean, part of me thinks fuck him, but also it's like, I don't know. I don't necessarily celebrate anyone's death, but
Yeah.
he was harmful.
Yeah. It's funny because obviously like other religious leaders have died, in the
Right.
past and whatever. His death just hit differently. And it's this weird grappling. I think that people don't even know how influential he was
Hmm.
in like evangelical fundamentalism, Christian culture for decades. And so, and in like in legislation, like you were talking about, it's like how poetic that this happened like during Pride Month, right? I mean,
Yeah.
which is it's bizarre,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I've really had to sit with that the last, week or whatever since his death of going like, how do we not celebrate death, but like how do we acknowledge that yeah, this harmful person is not here anymore, spreading like really, really awful rhetoric and awful messages to that are deeply harmful to people. And I know he's not the only one, and there's other loud voices that are going to come behind him, but in some ways, he's kind of the last of a generation of people that are kind of selling these messages and doing it on the backs of people who are, struggling financially and taking advantage of people who are, older, or like, it's just there's so many layers to him.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
because I know we've mentioned like the anti LGBTQ legislation that he's like been such a proponent of, especially anti-trans stuff. I think about all the comments that he made like after 9/11 and
Mhm.
stuff like that, of like, this is because we're allowing for gay marriage and gay people to be humans essentially. But he did so much of like getting money from people, and basically kind of like a health and wealth gospel. So
Mhm.
if you give money, God is going to bless you, and those sorts of things, which is really just disgusting. And yet, I mean, I'm trying to think if we ever had, well, we didn't really have TV growing up, so we didn't have like the 700 Club like running in the background, but of course we all
Yeah.
knew who he was. But yeah, I mean, he was not a good human. I
Mhm.
don't have a lot of words to describe him
Yeah.
other than he just wasn't a good human.
Yeah.
And he ran for president back in the 80s. I think
Yeah,
he
he did. I forgot about that.
against George. Well, that's when George H.W. Bush got the
Mhm.
Republican nomination, but he ran for president back then. So he was deeply influential. I know he was kind of, quote unquote, in bed with Jerry Falwell Sr., the religious right, the moral majority, the religious roundtable, like those. I mean, they were all intertwined, but
Mhm.
this is a guy who used his position to do so much harm.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And so that, I mean, like, so like I said, like the world is a better, safer place.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's not and if someone even feels uncomfortable saying, that someone was an inherently bad or
Mm-hmm.
evil person, because I know, because even I sometimes struggle with like, is there really such thing as bad people?
Mm-hmm.
Especially the more work that I do into
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
underpinnings of the healing work I've
Yeah.
done. I won't get into that now, but
Yeah.
it's still fair to say, okay, but what he did, like the behaviors he did, the things he said, they caused harm.
Mm-hmm.
Even
Mm-hmm.
if it came from a place where he, in his own self-deluded state, thought he was doing God's work, whatever. Maybe he
Yeah.
thought that, but it
Mm-hmm.
caused immense untold harm. And that is
Yeah.
something I'm pretty sure we could actually measure and quantify if we really started, looking
Yeah.
into it. And so, yeah, I don't,
Mm-hmm.
it's perfectly fair to, I think, be relieved, be happy, whatever, that
Yeah.
that voice is gone.
Yeah. And I think what you just said there, the relief part, maybe that's where like if people are struggling to know like how did like it feels icky to like celebrate somebody's death or something like that. I get that like deeply.
Mm-hmm.
But the word relief really stands out, what you just said there. Like
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay, this is a person who has been on our TV every day for decades, spouting out messages that are deeply harmful, spouting out just really awful untruths, things that just, and he's a grifter, like
Oh
and
yeah.
so there's so much like the relief of like, okay, we don't have to celebrate that somebody has died, and we can be relieved that their message is no longer being spread in that format. Like it's not coming from Pat Robertson, essentially. I think that's maybe where I'm landing
Mm-hmm.
as we're talking this through, because I can have an amount of empathy for saying, I believe that he believed he was doing good. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think he was, but I
Mm-hmm.
think he thought he was. And so I can have empathy in the sense that there was a time where I did that too, where I was spreading
Mm-hmm.
really deeply harmful messages, where I was engaging in harmful behaviors and words and things like that before I quote unquote woke up,
Mm-hmm.
before I left all of that. And so I can be empathetic in that sense of believing that you're doing well or good, or God's word or what God wants. But then the practicalities of it being on the other side of that and knowing the harm that it causes
Mm-hmm.
is really sad. I don't know. It's not so cut and dry.
Yeah. 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 It's not, but yeah, I guess my biggest takeaway too, or my one of the big things I think that I've thought many times as I'm reading different Twitter threads and all of that is, especially in light of relief, to use an analogy, like if imagine that somebody has their boot on your neck and you're like pinned to the ground and they're just crushing the life out of you. And something happens that removes them and that is no longer happening. You're inevitably going to be relieved, probably going to be overjoyed. Who the hell am I or anybody else to tell you that you shouldn't feel that way?
Yeah.
So that's my biggest thing, is when people are coming in with these prescriptive hot takes of what you should be feeling, or trying to
Mm,
bring shame that you shouldn't be celebrating as much as you are. That,
yeah.
I think, is what really bothers me. I
Mm,
not really trying to celebrate the death part specifically, but if that's where
yeah.
you're at and that's your response, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, I am not going to
Yeah.
shame you for celebrating the
Totally.
fact that this harmful voice is no longer harming you. So,
Yeah. I think that's such a good analogy. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Because that, yeah, that's it just speaks to our human need for air, relief, right? A break from that
mhm,
oppressive boot in this
mhm,
case, or
yeah,
Pat Robertson.
yeah, yes.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So just I think I know the answer to this. Did you ever send money to the 700 Club?
Well, um, no, but that's because I was a good Seventh-day Adventist and kept it in-house. I sent money to Doug Batchelor. My
Wait,
Adventist listeners will know about that.
Doug Batchelor?
Yep.
His last name was Batchelor?
That is actually
Okay.
his name. Yeah, that is actually his name. One of our more famous, I don't know, pastors,
Okay.
televangelists. I don't know. Yeah. Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Well, I did not send money either. I don't know if anybody in my family ever did, but very grateful to have some relief from him, and am hoping that maybe some of the messages that he was preaching hopefully will end with him also. We'll say that.
Absolutely hope so.
Yes. All right. Any other prayer requests that you have for today, Andrew? Or does this feel like a good place to wrap it up? It's up to you.
I think that is good for today. I cannot think of anything else.
Okay. All right. Then we will trust that we have given our prayer requests up for whoever needs to hear them. Amen.
This episode is one of our touchstone topics, which means they are foundational to this podcast. We will be doing episodes on our touchstone topics a couple times each year in order to act as a foundation for the things we talk about and resolving and recovering from religious trauma.
Hmm.
So, today's touchstone topic: what is the nervous system? Quite a
Yes.
broad question, but
Yeah.
in 3 words or less. I'm just kidding. But
Yeah.
but Laura, what is the nervous system? What would you say
Yeah.
to somebody who asked that question?
Yeah. So if we want to go real technical, it is cranial nerve number 10. Right. But that means nothing to most people unless you're neurology and physiology nerds. But in its most technical term, the nervous system is built around the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. It is a nerve that starts at the base of our skull and runs all the way down to our abdomen, our belly, our stomach, and has little tentacles that connects to all of our visceral organs. And what that means essentially is that it is a nerve that receives information from the outside world and helps our bodies determine what to do next. It is something that controls everything subconsciously, from breathing to body temperature to heart rate, to resting and digesting and fighting and flighting and freezing, and all these weird trauma terms that we've heard of are all connected to the nervous system. The nervous system, or the vagus nerve, is bidirectional, which is unlike some other nerves. But what that means is that it sends information from our brain to our body and our body to our brain. But what makes this nerve unique is that 80% of the messages come from our body to our brain instead of the other way around. And that's important in the trauma piece, which I know we'll talk about later. But it really is like it's like the helps operate like the motherboard of our, if we think of like Star Trek, like a motherboard, and it helps us operate all of our day-to-day functions, and really it helps us survive. So that is way more than 3 words. But
That's okay. There's 3
yeah,
paragraphs with,
three,
same
yeah,
thing.
3,000, you didn't say just 3. So yeah, that's kind of like what the nervous system is in terms of how it functions. I know we'll get there, but yeah, anything to add to that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think I guess just kind of carrying over into, well, you did answer kind of how it functions in our daily life, but like it's a
Yeah.
thing where you're not conscious of it, but it's always there.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
functioning. And I think that's the thing that's
Mhm.
so important for, especially in the context of unpacking religious trauma,
Mhm.
is just that. And of course, we'll
Yeah.
unpack that too. We'll continue to get to that. But I guess that would be my only thing. And
Mhm. Yeah.
I feel like that's important, you know?
Yeah. I know that, I guess maybe a better question to start with, because I definitely want to hear like how some of like nervous system practices and have operated in your own life, and I'll share some too.
Mhm.
I'm curious to know though, like if we just start on like a broad level of like kind of the correlation between nervous system and trauma. Like if you're explaining that to a client in your office, what are you sharing with them?
So definitely when it comes to like the religious trauma and then like just how your nervous system shows up, I think the biggest thing that I emphasize with folks is just that the way trauma shows up is it shows up in this embodied way.
Hmm.
It's not, and therefore it's also not something that is cognitive in the sense that you can just think your way out of it. Like,
Yeah,
yes, it can
absolutely.
cause distressing thoughts, absolutely, and distressing
Mhm.
cognitive patterns and whatnot,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's your nervous system it's you're reacting to a perceived threat, and your body is
Hmm.
going into high alert. It's preparing to do what it has to do to stay safe.
Hmm.
And furthermore, there's not really a time conception in that part of the brain when
Yeah.
that part is activated, when it's your nervous system and you're going into like this mode of survival. Your prefrontal cortex, I'll do a little bit of brain stuff, but I don't,
Yeah.
the thing is it's like, yeah, the rational part of your brain that understands and is telling yourself like, hey, that was 20 years ago, calm down. Like, yeah,
Hmm.
well, that part doesn't understand the concept of 20 years ago. It understands the
Hmm.
concept of threat, and right now there's a
Hmm.
threat. And
Yeah.
I think just that concept alone is incredibly helpful. It's very helpful. I
Yeah.
think it's validating too, because I think a lot of folks who
Hmm.
don't have very limited understanding of the nervous system and how all of that works can feel
Hmm.
pretty distressed by like, I've been doing so great, and then suddenly this thing happened and I was triggered and I felt like I
Hmm.
was 6 years old
Back
all
there.
over again, but I
Yeah.
know I'm not. What the hell?
Hmm.
And so just normalizing that experience, I think
Yeah.
that's been pretty foundational in a lot of what I do with
Yeah.
clients.
I love that. Yeah. And like, I think, if you haven't listened to the first episode that we did where we talked about like what is trauma, what is religious trauma, that could be a great episode to listen to. But the nervous system is definitely building, or this episode is building off of that episode, in the sense that I think both of us said last time, trauma is not the thing that happens to us, but it's our nervous system, our body's response to the thing that happens to us. It's a physiological response inside of us. And so, like you said, when there's a perceived threat or when there's a real threat, or
Mhm.
something that we remember, like a remembered threat, real, perceived, or remembered, our nervous system is like constantly scanning 24/7 for danger, and it's there in the service of our survival. And so if there's a real or perceived or remembered threat, our nervous system, deep beneath our conscious mind, determines what do I need to do in order to keep myself safe. And that's where we oftentimes see responses like fight or flight or freeze or fawn, because our nervous system determines like, hey, here's this threat in front of me, and I can fight my way out of this, or I can run away from this. And so you hit on something so important. In those moments when our nervous system is triggered, that prefrontal cortex part of our brain is like completely offline. We don't necessarily have access to like the rational, logical parts of our brain where we can be like, well, I'm not 6, I'm 36. Like our that part of our brain is off. And like you said, it's this like timeless void, And all of a sudden it's like our body is acting as if we are 6 or we are, in that past experience, and our nervous system is looking for a way to keep us safe, oftentimes doing the thing that we wish we could have done back then but never had the opportunity to do that. And so I think, I know I've experienced this myself, my clients have, where it's like, yeah, they get triggered and there's so much shame that happens because they're like, I know that thing isn't real, or it was just a trigger, or, it's over or whatever. And yet my body is still having this physiological response. And that just shows like there's still some stuck trauma energy there. There's still some stuff that hasn't been fully resolved. And that shows us where the work is. But I think, one thing I like to also let people know is like, our nervous systems, like, even if we don't have trauma, our nervous systems are designed for safety, to like orient us towards safety. And so that means that everybody is going to have fight and flight and freeze and fawn responses, even if we don't have trauma. And some people call them trauma responses. I call them nervous system responses, right? There's a threat, like my dog starts scream barking and you might see me go like this. And even though I know it's probably just the mailman, like, I just have this instant response, right? I go into like this, well, you're not in my body, but I'd be like so angry and I want to yell at her to calm down, right? And that has nothing to do with any trauma for me, but my body still went into that response. And so I think it's like really important to normalize, like, our body is working exactly how it's supposed to be. Our nervous system is working exactly how it's supposed to be. With trauma, though, these things are overwhelming our nervous system. So like when my dog is scream barking, at some point, my brain and body clicks back on. And it's like, oh God, it's just the mailman. And you know what? Actually, it's good because he's delivering my package that I, ordered a few days ago. And it's like, okay, we're good. Right. And I just go along my day. But when overwhelming situations happen, when we talked like last time, too much, too soon, too fast, overwhelms our ability to cope, our nervous system isn't able to come back down to a place of safety of going, yeah, it's just the mailman. That's just my dog being my dog, or whatever it is. It keeps us in this state of like constantly activated, turned on, fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system. And that's what we're working with in trauma. But I think a lot of people get really confused and ashamed when they're like, this energy is coming up, even though there's like nothing technically wrong or dangerous going on.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely hear things similar to that. I would quite frequently, like, the idea that my response is disproportionate to the threat. And then there's shame relating to that. They're like, why the hell am I overreacting like this? Right.
Yes.
Maybe like a phrase someone might say. And, of course, I do parts work, as I said, I think last time, and I don't think that there's such thing as an irrational thought or reaction. I think
no,
and that's where I think curiosity and compassion goes a long way, because it is what it is. Whether you think you should be feeling something or not, like, it's beside the point. Like, your body is experiencing what it's experiencing, and the sooner we can sit with that with compassion and patience and curiosity, I think the quicker we can actually show up and help that part of ourselves. But that definitely correlates with like nervous system responses, the idea that not like being a disproportionate response, which rationally I understand that. I would still argue, actually, it makes a lot of sense when you actually,
I think so too.
Sit with and understand that part of yourself.
Yeah. I know I have some thoughts of like how nervous system work has been helpful for me, but I'm curious to know from you, because I know this is a big focus of our work in the company, CTRR, and like all of us very much take this nervous system body centered approach to like resolving trauma. So yeah, for you personally, do you have any of those like anecdotes of, what has this work been like for you to work with the nervous system in your personal life?
Yeah. So, I mean, anecdotally, one of the first things I can think of, and when I first started working with a therapist who was trying to think what he actually called himself. I think he might have actually been Gestalt, was his
interesting
background, but still very experiential, a lot of very somatic oriented and all of that. And honestly, getting pissed off was what I remember.
Yeah.
That's the big thing I remember.
Like about something specific, or just him like bringing the nervous system in and kind of framing it in that way?
Well, Yeah, all of it, I guess.
Okay.
I really like and respect this guy. What was
Mm.
frustrating to me as I'm thinking back was how disembodied I was, because I was so
Oh,
fairly fresh out of Seventh-day Adventism, out of Christian fundamentalism, where the
yeah.
programming is your flesh is wicked, your heart's deceitful.
Yes.
All of that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was not somebody who was even remotely in tune with what my body was feeling in any sort of a
Yeah.
physical or somatic sense, right? Like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if I had a headache, I could tell you that. If I stubbed my
Yeah.
toe, I suppose I could tell you that. But like, you know, ask me
Yeah.
how I'm feeling. Well, and I'll say sad, for example. Like, okay, what does that feel like? Where is that showing up for you? I'm like, what the fuck
Mm.
does that mean? Like, I told you I'm
Yeah.
sad. I know I'm sad. I'm telling you I'm sad. And he's like, no, I believe you. He's like, I know you're sad.
Yes.
He's like, I believe you.
Yeah.
He's like, and I know you know
Yeah.
that. He's like, I'm just curious what part of you is saying that, what part of your body is and feeling that, and what does
Wow.
that feel like, what's the sensation like? And I don't
Mm.
remember all the things he said. I just remember
Mm-hmm.
at first it was a disconnect because that was such a foreign concept for me. That was such
Yeah.
a foreign way of relating to my body. Like, I was very good at intellectualizing stuff.
Mm.
I'm still am, but like back then,
Mm-hmm.
like it just completely was over my head,
Yeah.
completely did not resonate with like what, you ask me how I'm feeling and I tell you, and then you're still asking me how do I really feel. Like, what the fuck, dude? I don't know what you're asking. um and so
Yeah.
that was my first
Yeah.
experience with work that was like
Okay.
really embodiment focused.
Mm-hmm.
um
Mm-hmm. It is so interesting because you're right, like the disembodiment within fundamentalism, like the promoting of like disembodiment is so strong. And yet that's what we need to heal. Like that's how we resolve trauma. I had done so much work, like more intellectual work around trauma, similar to you, before I ever like discovered my body essentially. Which was on the one hand like so frustrating because I had all the books in in my own personal library. Every like somatic healing, nervous system, I had them all because they look good on my shelf. And there was like curiosity that was piqued like in earlier parts of my life and my career where I was like, oh, this is so interesting. But I think maybe I wasn't ready for it because body work, somatic work, nervous system work is not pleasant, and it's very intentional. I mean, it can be pleasant, but it is so different than simply just thinking through things. And when I finally was like relenting, was like, okay, I'm going to do this weird body thing or whatever. I'd already been working with a somatic therapist, somebody who had been, who is certified in somatic experiencing. So I was, familiar with some like how sadness lived in my body or those sorts of
mhm,
things. But I wasn't really it didn't really click until, one day. So there's a path, kind of a hiking trail path or whatnot that I walk on many, many times every week. It's something I'm very familiar with. I feel like I know every inch of that path. And it is my place for like my own therapy. And, it's really awesome. And I had walked the path about 5 miles the day before. So many times before that, that wasn't about being out of shape, but I started walking and all of a sudden my body went into this panic. And I was like, well, that's really weird. I had enough cognition to be like, okay, this doesn't feel like a panic attack. I've experienced those. I didn't have like the ramp up to that, but I just kind of cupped my hands over my mouth and I focused on my breathing to kind of get it recirculated. My heart rate came back down and I was like, okay, well, that was weird. That's just a fluke, but we'll just keep walking. And it happened again. And I was like, okay, what is happening? And it happened a third time. And I was only probably a quarter mile into the path. And I was like, I was out of breath. I'm like, I just walked this path. It's, and like, I've only got a quarter mile. And I was like, and I knew I was coming up on a hill that I was going to have to walk up. And I thought, okay, am I going to like literally die? Because I can't even walk downhill without my heart rate increasing. And something in me said, keep going. And, and so I start walking up the hill. And of course, my heart rate starts to rise. And intuitively, my body was like, don't put your hands over your mouth and regulate, just focus on everything around you. And I started orienting to the time and space. And so I tuned into my dog who is like scampering along the trail, and I let myself feel the sun beaming down and the wind kind of blowing across my face. I felt what it was like for my feet to hit the ground of the trail. I really paid attention to the different shades of green that were on the leaves in the trees. And all of a sudden, as I'm walking up the hill, my heart rate is starting to come down, which is this very like counterintuitive thing. And I got to the top of the hill and I burst into tears because I knew I had just like unlocked something inside me that was like key to what was happening. And I realized that my body had been experiencing any rise in heart rate, even from something good like exercise, as a threat. That sympathetic fight or flight energy was like, oh gosh, we are in danger. We have to mobilize. And for whatever reason on that day, my body felt safe enough to allow for a different experience. And so I walked that trail faithfully, like every day for 10 months, just like orienting and getting my nervous system back on track. And I remember about 10 months after that, I walked to the top of the hill. And the only reason my heart rate increased was because I was walking up a hill, and I burst into tears again. And but it was like gratitude this time, because it was like, oh my gosh, like how amazing that like my body is feeling safe and it trusts me. And it like, I get teary every time I talk about it because it was such a transformational moment. And it was like, those were the moments where like the healing was happening, and my life has been transformed since that point. And it's something I still do. I still walk that trail many times every week. I still orient to my surroundings. It is my safe place. It is where I go in my mind when I'm activated and I need to be able to help myself feel regulated. But it was really important for me to have that experience. And it was transformational, and something that I talk about with my clients a lot too. So, I mean, I have other stories, but that's like one of my most profound ones.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. No, I love that. It's
Yeah.
so nice. It's so just cathartic and amazing when
Yeah.
you do have moments of clarity like that too. Like
Yeah.
you're doing the work, you're healing, you're in that process,
Yeah.
and being aware of it too as it's happening.
Yes.
It's gonna be a
Yeah.
really overwhelming in a good way
Yeah.
feeling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's so important to be able to like, share about that, because,
Yeah.
like we've been talking about, there is a lot of shame and guilt that can come from having these responses. Like in that moment, I did
Yes.
start to shame myself, right? Like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I walk even a quarter mile without my body having, this elevated heart rate, right? So, and I instantly went to that. It was instantly my fault. When in reality, when we can take that shame piece off and let it be neutral and just say, my body is having a response. I might not even need to know why, but I do know that I need to maybe provide a sense of safety to myself, or I need to find somebody to connect to, or orient myself to the surroundings. And when we can neutralize just the normal responses that our nervous system is having, the absence of shame actually like makes that healing possible, I think.
I'm just thinking, of all of the times because like I know my story started out with like, oh fuck this guy, the therapist that I was talking about, right?
Yeah.
But it's it is interesting, like just being able to return to being grounded, being present in
Yeah.
your body,
Yeah.
and how powerful and cathartic that can be.
Hmm.
You know,
Absolutely.
I think we've kind of touched on this, but I do want to like
Mhm.
specifically touch on it,
Yeah.
and just the idea of thinking our way out of trauma.
Yeah.
I don't know that anybody really words it that way. Maybe they do, but
Hmm.
I definitely know a lot of folks try to do that. And I know that
Yeah.
because, well, anecdotally, I did that too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes. Me
I did
too.
that too. Even as a
Yeah.
young therapist,
Hmm.
it's funny that I have another
Hmm.
anecdote with the same therapist that I saw. And
Yeah.
like you, I had a lot of books on trauma. I was doing a lot of research on trauma. I was attending different
Yeah.
seminars on trauma informed
Hmm.
modalities.
Hmm.
And yeah, this therapist was really good at stepping on my toes in the most therapeutic way. He basically told me, or suggested, I don't remember how he said it, but basically the idea that I think he said, I wonder, I think is what the word he used.
Mm.
He's like, I wonder if he's like, I wonder if doing all these trainings, reading all these books is actually serving as a barrier so you don't have to actually sit with your own stuff.
Ooh. Oh, yes, I feel
And
that.
he was right. And I was
Yeah.
not pleased, but he was right. He was
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I think I interestingly have had a therapist say almost that exact same thing to me, not quite so eloquently and with much more shame. Um,
Mm,
but there is something there true to that, right? Like it is one thing to know about trauma. And actually, I find when we're talking especially about like complex trauma, which I would put religious trauma in that category. Again, we talked about that in our last episode, but I think there is something actually really important about people understanding trauma, physiology, nervous system. There is something that when you go like, oh gosh, I'm reading, this is how the nervous system functions. I can see that in my own life, my own body. That's actually normal. Okay, like that cognitive piece certainly can help. But
mm,
as it
mhm,
comes to like actually resolving trauma, we can't think it away. We can't just, it's like the person who has tons of anxiety. It doesn't work to just be like, hey, just calm down. Right.
mhm,
Like we giggle about that now. Like nobody ever, actually calmed down from, being told to calm down. Like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. Right. It's the same thing with trauma. Like we can't, it's in the past. It wasn't that bad. It's not happening now. Those might be nice sentiments and even true, but
mhm.
that's not what happens. That's not what's happening in our body. And so you had mentioned earlier, kind of that bypassing of time. So like when
Mhm.
our brain goes offline, that prefrontal cortex part of our brain, when that goes offline, that's our seat of logic, our seat of ration, our ability to cognitively understand things. And when real perceived or remembered threat comes in, when there's that overwhelm, that part of our brain turns off, and we're left with the reptilian and mammalian part of our brains that are only acting in the service of our survival and can rationalize anything, even though it's not rational necessarily. So that's why we get some big responses like fight or flight, even to these little minuscule things. Or that's where we see overblown, maybe responses that are disproportionate to what is happening. And it's because those parts of our brain have been mobilized and said, there is a threat, warning, we need to do something about it. And so I think it's also important to recognize that when we have those overwhelming experiences coming in, there's other parts of our brain that are shutting off. That's the part of our brain that's in control of our language and understanding time. Right. And so our body then doesn't, or our brain and body working together doesn't have the ability to say that is in the past necessarily. If we don't resolve that trauma, our body thinks it's still happening right
Mhm.
now. And so to simply say, well, you're not there. It's not the past, whatever. That cognitively might be a nice and true thought, but our body isn't understanding it as such because that energy, that
Mhm.
overwhelm is still living in the body. So unless we address it from that nervous system, that body-based perspective, we're going to be carrying around that energy. And
Mhm.
that's where we see various symptoms, whether they're physiological, relational, psychological, emotional symptoms that come out in a variety of ways that really can then impede our lives. And that's where we start to see clients in our office where they'll say, yeah, that thing happened, but that was in the past. But gosh, I cannot for the life of me hold a boundary, or I have all these like odd like gastrointestinal issues that my doctor is like, there's nothing wrong with you physically, but my body's
Mhm.
responding in this different way. And so I think to understand how trauma lives in the body and the nervous system, we can't just think it away. We can't just say, oh, that was in the past. That's actually very important to unlocking how we actually resolve from our trauma. And I feel like I just got on a soapbox, so I'm going to wrap it up.
No, that's good. That's good. And I think that's all very important and very important to understand because
Yeah.
yeah, you can't. It's like
Mhm.
you can't just rationalize it away and tell apart. Well, like, well, that's not what's happening. You shouldn't feel that way. Oh, that's. I think anybody who's ever had, like, for example, a panic attack understands that that doesn't work. That does
Yeah.
not work. Your rational
Yeah.
brain can know that, but like we just said, when that's part of your prefrontal cortex, and when that part is offline in the midst of one of these nervous system responses,
Mm-hmm.
That part of your brain might know this thing, but the part that's responding right now does
Yeah.
not know that thing. And
Yes,
and
absolutely.
that's just that's why there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
I'm I'm
agree.
I'm I'm curious how just for the sake of everyone listening, how I'm thinking how we want to articulate this, but I would like to talk a little bit about how high control religion specifically bypasses bypasses our nervous
Mm-hmm.
system, how it
Yeah.
or how it
Yeah.
manipulates, if that's not too strong of a word, how it manipulates our nervous
Yeah.
system. Because I
Yes.
know I know there's a lot there. I know there's a lot to unpack, and I think
Mm-hmm.
really putting in some concrete terms for folks, like how that works, how that shows
Yeah.
up, how it lingers
Yeah.
in your body even years after you've left. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we both talked about it in this episode, like this
Hmm.
focus of like disembodiment. I mean, they don't call it that in high control religion. They'll say things like the body is evil, your flesh is sinful, right? And so you're
Hmm.
primed already to kind of divorce yourself from your body. But
Right.
also, when that's the messaging, then any natural, normal signals that your body is giving you, and that could even be things like, I'm hungry. I'm tired. I need to rest. I'm full. I need to use the restroom. Sexual desires. Those are all because they're coming from your body. And if your body is evil, then those cues are evil. So you can imagine then if there's anxiety or feelings of guilt or whatnot, like then that's only affirming the messages of how our bodies are evil and why we need some sort of a savior figure to come in and literally save us from ourselves. Right. And so it takes all of these natural cues that are inherent to us and calls them sin and calls
Hmm.
them evil and calls them fleshly and tries to cut them off and say, no, 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 you just need to pray more. You need to read your Bible more. You need to trust God more. You need to deny yourself more. Like I think about how many 40-day liquids only fasts I
Hmm.
did in my 20s. I did over a dozen of them. And I literally mistook my feelings of extreme hunger as the Holy Spirit trying to get my attention and pray more and submit more and confess more. I really believed that my bodily responses were that it wasn't like,
Yeah.
yeah, you've actually been depriving yourself of food for 35 days. You need to eat. Like that's where I was. But yeah, I'm curious to know, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah. You touched on this, but just the overarching theme of you can't trust yourself.
Oh, yeah.
That
Yeah.
I see it show up in so many ways, but just the theme that you cannot trust yourself. And like you said,
Mm-hmm.
it's like that the idea that well, don't be in the flesh, whatever that means.
Oh,
But like
yeah.
being in the flesh versus being in the spirit. And so
Mm,
basically anything where you are actually being in tune with things that your body is telling you is seen as being
yeah.
in the flesh, i.e. sinful,
Yes.
something to be avoided, something that is
Mm-hmm.
pathologized, demonized, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's, I mean, it touches all parts of life.
Mm-hmm.
It's.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely, I think, really hits hard in areas around like human sexuality, for example, and
Yeah.
relationships
Mm-hmm.
with food, especially.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll speak briefly, like Adventism specifically, it really emphasizes a health
Yes.
message. I know Mormonism does too, at least in terms of
Mm-hmm.
caffeine. Adventists are
Yes.
anti-caffeine as well. Um, Also very
Yeah.
pro-vegetarian, but at any rate, I won't go down that
Mm-hmm.
rabbit trail. But the
Yeah.
point is, though, it's like you really start to build up these relationships with like food, and like just like you said, I'm just hungry.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm just
Yeah.
hungry. My body is telling me I need food, please. And
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
itself is like being shamed and turned into like
Yeah.
something that it's not, where like it's the Holy Spirit trying to get my attention.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of my wicked
Yeah.
flesh that I'm
Mm-hmm.
craving, I don't know, pizza
Yeah.
right now or whatever. you know.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no room for humanity. You know what I mean? Like in a high
Yeah.
control religion, we're talking about the nervous system and everything. There is no room to just be a human.
Hmm.
Like everything is spiritualized and mostly vilified. The food thing really resonates with me. Like I mean, on a very personal level, like one of my biggest struggles in the last few years has been recognizing that I have been unintentionally starving myself for over a decade, probably closer to 20 years, because of these messages of, your body is evil and sinful, and you must kill it, suppress it, make your body a slave to Christ, right? And I learned how to shut all of those cues off. And now here I am at age 40, and I am having to learn how to eat and how to listen that, like, oh, that's a hunger cue. I need to eat food. I shouldn't wait 5 more hours to eat food. Like, my body's hungry now, and that's okay. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with my body. It just needs some fuel. That's it. Like, and taking off stigmas and just like neutralizing it of like, this is just what my body needs right now. And there isn't room for that in high control religion. And I also, the other thing I was thinking of is like how high control religion really emphasizes like a constant state of sympathetic nervous system action or activity, which is going to be our fight or flight response. Like, I think about all the verses that we're taught of like, be on guard. The devil is out to get you. People are going to try to pull you down. They're going to persecute you. Like, you've got to always be ready to give an answer. And it's like these verses in the Bible and holy texts that are like basically telling you, you're going to be taken down. You're going to be attacked. People are not going to like you. And that registers in our brain and our body as dangerous, right? And so then that means that we are constantly activated, and we're seeing the world through that lens. So somebody could look at you with like resting bitch face, and all of a sudden you're like, you're against me. You're persecuting me. You think there's something wrong with me. And I go into this huge fight response when really somebody's like, oh my God, I was like literally zoned out. Right. And so I think that like that piece too, of like this constant sympathetic nervous system energy is very key. And I know that's a little bit different than bypassing, but that is very common for people in high control religion. But then that also gets taken out. Even if you leave, like that still is living inside of our body. And we often replicate that in other relationships and systems. Yeah.
Yeah. That really resonates. And one thing that I've often shared with clients, because one thing, and this is common, I think, in any kind of trauma healing, but like the rationalization that what I went through wasn't that bad, and the other folks went through worse, and therefore what I went through is, I don't know, is it trauma?
Yeah.
Maybe not. It wasn't that bad. That kind of thing. But one thing that I definitely emphasize with folks is, even if you didn't go through a traumatic experience that was like overtly physically threatening or damaging, maybe it was, quote, just religious trauma. I don't think that's still a big thing, but even if that's all it was, the thing is, being threatened with shame, being threatened with social rejection, that elicits the same type of physiological response in us. And the thing is, I even get all nerdy and go down the trail of evolutionary biology. I had a professor who was a psychologist and all that back many years ago. And one of his favorite phrases that I remember from him is, he would say, a lone monkey is a dead monkey. So the threat of social isolation and rejection absolutely can elicit a fight or flight response. And it is as serious as life or death. It can be anyway.
Yes.
So don't, there's a part of us that wants to minimize that, but there really is a very deep biological need to be socially accepted too. And I think that's part of the hold that high control religions have over folks, is this threat of being ostracized, losing your community. That is scary.
Yes, to all of that. Preach it, right? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think it's so true. Somewhere along the way, I don't know if they were evolutionary biologists or psychologists or people who came up with religion, but they figured out very basic human needs and were able to take those and twist it and create a space for it within religion, but then also a terror of like, if you reject this or God or our system or whatever it is, like your most basic human needs are not going to be met anymore. And in fact, they will maybe be exploited. You will be, devastated. And I think that I don't know why religion took that as the corner market, but it speaks to very, very basic human needs and really can exploit that within us, and makes it very scary then to leave, right? Like you said, a
Mhm.
lone monkey is a dead monkey. So if I'm cut off from the church and I lose everything from my community, my family, maybe my resources, but also now like the devil is out to get me and I can be pulled down and people are going to be after me, that's very scary. And you can understand why it would be difficult to leave that, but also why you might carry that out of there, and relationships might be scary, and it might be hard to say no. It might be difficult to speak up for yourself, and so we
Mhm.
see that those things that happen within the high control religion, like our nervous systems were formed and shaped and acclimated to that environment for survival, and simply leaving it behind and saying, no, 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 I don't believe that anymore, I'm not a part of that belief, that does not mean that your nervous system is on board with it yet. It hasn't caught up yet. And so I think
Mhm.
that's where we see probably a lot of people in our offices, especially with the shame piece, going, I don't get it, I left religion a long time ago, but it still feels like I'm back there, it feels like I'm still dealing with the same things. And I think that's where the nervous system pieces come in. What do you see as kind of the benefits of engaging with the nervous system as a part of resolving religious trauma? Why is that important?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's different ways to word this, but one of the ways I would look at it is that you're resolving things at the root as
Mm,
opposed to managing symptoms.
I think
Um,
that's a beautiful way to say it. Yeah.
I feel like, and this is not to dump on other models or other therapies, but I
Hmm.
feel like ones that are more cognitive only in their approach, it's
Hmm.
not that you won't see positive results, you will. And
Hmm.
I would also say usually that's just managing symptoms. You're
Yeah.
building up coping skills, you're learning to do things that are helpful, they increase quality of life, they help things.
Yeah.
But at the core, you still have these parts of you that are
Hmm.
carrying this burden, that
Yeah.
are still feeling unsafe with these certain
Hmm.
stimuli that when they show up
Hmm.
are overwhelmed. And
Yeah.
so I do
Yeah.
think stuff that is based in somatic work, embodiment type work, nervous system work, that's
Hmm.
trauma informed in that sense, I do think is I just think it's serving people better in the long run, because it's really trying to get to the root of what is showing up, rather than just simply, for example, saying, oh, you have panic attacks, well, let's do something to make the panic attack go away. And so
Hmm.
when the panic attack is no longer coming up, okay, great, that's success. Which,
Right.
that's part of the story. Yeah, obviously, I
Hmm.
don't want you to suffer from panic attacks. That's
Right.
true. But I'm also
Right.
curious about what's eliciting that response in the first place. Why is your body not
Yeah.
feeling safe in the first place?
Mm.
What is coming up for you? And
Yeah.
going that route, rather than just simply looking at how it's manifesting and trying to stop that.
Yeah. I think that is so well said. I know I can speak from my own experience that there was a lot of years of therapy that I did before I recognized trauma as trauma, which is a whole other story and sometimes makes me really angry. I'm like, oh my gosh, I did all this work, and it wasn't in vain, right? Like there were some really wonderful things that I learned how to do and things about myself that
Mhm.
I am so grateful for, but it really was symptom management. And I think I work with a lot of clients who have a very similar story and have done lots of great work, but they're still not feeling safe in their bodies. They're still
Mhm.
having these what feel like disproportionate physiological reactions. And I think you're absolutely right when you say when we go to the root, whether we want to call that trauma or the nervous system, I mean,
Mhm.
they're pretty intertwined, and we hit the root, some of those issues naturally alleviate themselves without really having to focus on them at all, and or some of the issues become much easier to work with, right? So when I know how to find safety in my body, and then there's the possibility of a panic attack, I might have other skills to bring myself back into my body, to find a sense of safety, to find connection and deal with it in a different way. And that doesn't mean I'll never have a panic attack again, but it just means that
Mhm.
I have some different skills and resources to help me through that, and I'm not just simply managing and holding my breath for like, when's the next panic attack going to come,
Yeah.
and I think it's I the root thing. Absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
I am very curious, and I'm sure listeners are too. What would be some
Yeah.
ways to help to restore some of that internal safety? Like, I
Mm,
mean, if you were to think of like just I don't know, like a way that would make sense to
yeah.
just the average person listening?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a very eclectic therapist in that I don't say like there's this one way of therapy and
Mhm.
it's the only right way, right? Like everybody's very different. But one thing that I will hang my hat on a little bit is that I really believe foundationally that internal safety is one of like the things that needs to be established for other trauma resolution to happen. And so when I say internal safety, I think it's worth like explaining it a little bit in that it's finding a sense of safety within ourselves. So something can be happening around us, and we can tune into our insides and feel a sense of groundedness or stability or security. I think that's especially important with religious trauma because, like we just talked about, we are encouraged or it is demanded of us to be disembodied, to divorce ourselves from our body and outsource everything. I
Mhm.
look to other people, I look to holy texts, I look to other things to tell me if I'm good or bad, right or wrong, if I'm safe or I'm unsafe, if I'm doing the what I'm supposed to do as a measurement for like if I'm saved or how things are going, right? And so it's all outward focused. So when we talk about internal safety, we're saying, yeah, things can be happening out there, but I have a sense of calm or groundedness within me. And when we can do that, then we start to be able to like expand our window of tolerance, be able to deal with triggers, be able to, do all these other things. So I say that as a precursor to saying that also those people with religious trauma often have no experience with any sort of internal safety, especially if you've grown up in that religion, right? Because from the moment that we were born or our earliest memories, we're told your body is evil. You look to your parents, you look to your Sunday school teacher, you look to your pastor to tell you what to do. Your body's bad and evil, right? And so I think it's really important to develop a sense of internal safety. But I think for those of us with more complex trauma, which of course is religious trauma as well, we are starting from scratch.
Mhm.
Like we don't, most of us don't have memories of when we felt that way before. And so we're oftentimes having to create it from square one. So I know for me, when I work with clients, sometimes what I'll have them do is literally like think of their favorite place on earth, and it can be real or imagined, and they don't have to have been there. It's just maybe they saw it in a calendar and they're like, oh, that looks lovely, right? And so what I'll have them do is I'll say, let's just, if it feels okay, to close your eyes and imagine that you are there. And then let's start to engage our senses. And I'll ask them to imagine themselves looking around that space. What are the things that they can see? What are the colors and the shapes? If they were to put their feet on the ground or their hands, touching places, what are the things that they would feel? What are the noises that they would hear or the scents that they would smell? Is there any taste that comes up? Or maybe their mouth is just watering. I don't know. And then I'll ask them to tune into their body and notice if there's any feeling of calm or relaxation that is matching what that environment is bringing about. And sometimes they can only do that for a few seconds, and that's okay. Right. And so then we'll kind of come out of that. And I'll talk about that as like, I call it an anchor. And I'll say
Mhm.
that can be our anchor of internal safety, because what you'll notice is we actually weren't on that cliff in Ireland. We weren't on that beach, right? We were here in this office, but you allowed your body to kind of be like act as if it was like as if you were in that scene and your whole body started to calm down, right? Maybe your chest expanded, or I could take a deeper breath, or my shoulders went down, or I leaned back in my chair, right? And there was this physiological shift internally. It was coming from within you because we weren't actually there. And so that's usually where I start. And I say, let's just build upon that. And so sometimes we'll bring that scene into the therapeutic or coaching spaces. If I notice that they're getting agitated or activated, I'll say, hey, let's go to Ireland, right? And we'll take a moment and we'll go there and we'll come back into our body and calm back down. And so we're building this capacity for what we're calling internal safety, the safety that is coming from within us. So that's how I start with clients. That's how I educate clients with that. And it's how I bring it into sessions. And I do this activity myself every day, at least once a day. for myself, not with clients, just for myself, to help my body remember, like, okay, I am safe. I'm here. I'm present in this moment. But yeah, now that I've, preached a sermon on internal safety, what's your sermon?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a sermon to,
That's okay.
outdo your sermon, but I am just impressed by the importance of just the senses, bringing the senses into it, because I do a lot of that,
Yeah.
and not even necessarily even imagined. I think that's really helpful too, though. But even just
Mhm.
grounding yourself to like,
Yes.
and I don't even mean in like the therapy office or in session.
Mhm.
I mean like you're like, for like, I do this myself walking through a park. Like there's the classic 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can
Touch.
touch,
Yep.
yeah, feeling. 2 things you can smell and 1 thing you can taste.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I even just
Yes.
run through that. At first it feels clunky because you're like, wait,
Mhm.
which one is which? But I mean,
Mhm.
I'll get to the point where like I just kind of run down it real fast myself.
Mhm.
And that, because oftentimes what's happening is, your body's get your there's like maybe thoughts that you're ruminating on, or a sensation that you're not even cognitively aware of, but that's like showing up in your body, and there's like constriction and tightness and distress, and then it starts to spiral. And even just taking my awareness from like this tunnel vision where I'm like walking down the sidewalk staring at my feet, just ruminating, lifting my gaze and even just becoming aware of other things around me, like, and then just becoming grounded in my senses of what is literally around me in the physical world around me, like that itself can help bring me back to a place of
Yes.
being grounded. And it's not to say that that's a magical fix, that, oh, the distress is gone, but it helps me be aware. It helps me
Yes.
come back to a place of awareness where I'm like, okay, I am feeling distress. I recognize there's a part of me that's feeling very distressed.
Mhm.
And I can also recognize I'm standing on the sidewalk at the park,
Yeah.
and my dog is trying to eat something he shouldn't be. Pull him away, and I'm
Yeah.
back in a place of awareness where I can be
Mm.
mindful of what I'm doing and the part of me
Yeah.
that maybe is struggling, and I can then give that part
Mhm.
attention. But
Yeah.
it's a difference of being able to intentionally approach that part of me with curiosity and compassion
Yeah.
versus being hooked by it and going for a ride
Yes.
and spiraling.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so wonderful because, like we've talked about this entire episode, is that, when we're triggered and activated, that part of our brain that's responsible for knowing we're in the here and now is offline, right? And so these more primitive parts of our brain are taking over and going, you are back then, right? Like you're 6 years old
Mm-hmm.
again, right? So the power of that presence is like, you're going, okay, I am activated, but I'm also here, right? You're helping your brain and body stay online. So you go, okay, this is maybe scary or
Mm-hmm.
this is overwhelming. And yet I'm right here. I have resources, right? I can
Mm-hmm.
phone a friend. I can cuddle with my dog. I can just inhale, look at the trees, whatever it might be, because I'm here, which means now I
Mm-hmm.
have choice. I always say like trauma is the opposite of choice, because when we're
Yes.
in those spaces of overwhelm, our body is just going for survival, whatever I need for survival. There's no choice. It's just make sure you survive. Right. And so that's not choice at all. That's survival. And so when we can use internal safety and groundedness and presence, we restore that choice and we go, okay, what do I need now? What would help me feel just a little bit safer? What would help me feel a little
Mm-hmm.
bit more connected, a little bit more curious? So I really love all of that. And it's cool. I think people are getting a flavor for like what it would be like to be, in a session with us or whatnot, because I think, and these practices on the surface sound really like, oh, that's so easy or whatever. They're not like, and it takes time to do it, especially when you're coming out of systems like we are, right? Where it's like, don't pay attention to your body at all.
Mm-hmm.
But they are so transformational. Like the simplicity of it is actually what makes it so profound.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, because I've had folks remark to me, they're like, "Holy shit, it was that easy or that simple."
Yeah.
But it's like
Yeah.
I would say it's not. I wouldn't say that it's easy, but it is simple. There
Mhm.
is like you
Yeah.
said,
I think that's,
there's absolutely a simplicity to it,
mhm.
and yeah, it can also be incredibly difficult and understandably so.
Yes.
understanding
Yeah.
where we've been and what our nervous systems have been through and
Mm-hmm.
what we've survived, and
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I think the simplicity is what kind of makes it so cathartic
Yeah.
and beautiful, really.
Yes. And also accessible. And I know,
Yes.
I'm trained in somatic experiencing. I went through that training. I know you've got some different trainings for trauma. There are some trainings where it's like you have to have a therapy degree, or you
Mhm.
have to go to a therapist in order to have that. Um, and one of the things that I love about nervous system work is truly that, like, it can be so helpful to have a coach or a therapist or somebody who's like walking alongside you and bearing witness to what it is that is going on. But these are also inherently within you. These skills that we just talked about are
Mhm.
within you, and you can do them on your own. You don't have to go to somebody's office to do this. And sometimes it's nice because, it's a break and it's support and it's all these things. And so I'm certainly not knocking that. But I think the beauty of nervous system work is that we all have one. And so we're bringing it home with us. And so we can try. We don't have to be in the presence of a person with degrees in
Mhm.
order to do this work. It is stuff that we can do every single day and makes it very accessible. We aren't always taught about it like in school or church or anything like that. But when we can learn some practices like this and incorporate it into our lives, like that's where we do start to see transformation. And that's all within you. And I think that's some of the most beautiful parts about it. It's coming from within you.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Folks always ask me, like, okay, what are your podcast recommendations? What are your book recommendations?
Mm,
What are your resource recommendations? Whatever.
yes.
There's so many
Yeah.
resources out there that I think are amazing. Well, okay, so if someone asks that question about this episode,
Yes.
what would be some resources that would be useful?
So if I have to go with a book, it is the Mind Body Stress Reset by Rebecca Ladine. Full disclosure, she was my therapist. She is wonderful. And all of her practices really are very similar to the things that you and I have talked about today. They're what I would call really soft practices, in the sense of they're not harsh on your nervous system. They could be very easy to implement. It's not going to take grinding effort to get through them, and they're very invitational in nature, right? You've got
Mhm.
permission and choice of what do I want to do. I think that's a really good book. I think I won't I know what you're going to pull out here. I would say that too, but I also think another really good free resource is Irene Lyon, Lyon. She has
Mhm.
a YouTube channel where she not only educates on the nervous system, but gives a lot of practices and then also a lot of very specific work. So, how would we work with the nervous system in anger? How do we work with the nervous system in childhood trauma, relationship difficulties, boundaries, all those sorts of things? She's got hours and hours of resources, and they're free. And so I would highly recommend that. And I'm so curious to hear, Andrew, what are some of your go-to resources?
Uh, Well, so two, I mean, I could think of so many, but two of them that I'll try to be succinct. In terms of books, and of course, I'm all about parts work, but I think this is a really
Yes.
good one. And the book is called No Bad Parts,
So good.
by Dr. Richard Schwartz. It's it's about parts work,
Mhm.
but it is very accessible. It is not a
Mm.
clinical manual. It is not
Yep.
something that you have to be a clinician in any capacity to read. And it's also not like a textbook where textbooks are like, $80 to $100 depending on,
Mhm.
it's pretty affordable. The other
Mhm.
thing I have personally found to be really useful is, so Deb Dana, uh,
Yes,
she has
fabulous.
done a lot of work with polyvagal theory and a
Mhm.
lot of stuff that involves the nervous system and embodiment type work.
Mhm.
The specific resource I'm literally looking at in front of me is actually a card deck. It's literally just called
Yes.
Polyvagal Card Deck, Deb Dana. I think you can probably find it online. You
Mhm.
probably can find it in Barnes and Noble, even, I would imagine, in
I think so.
places like that. And so,
Mhm.
and each card is just different, really brief little exercises. So it's really
Mhm.
not overwhelming. You can kind of just
Right.
kind of, and it kind of goes in order, like starting at
Mhm.
very basic
Yep.
stuff and kind of working up. It's really accessible. It's really useful. And if you're like me and struggle to sit down and read a book cover to cover,
Mhm.
it's a lot more bite-sized and a lot more
Yeah.
manageable in that sense. So I like it because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are great resources. I fully endorse both of those. Not that it matters, but no, they're great. I have my deck of cards over by my desk. So yeah.
Nice. I know you saw
Yeah.
it. I grabbed off my bookshelf and you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
already know what that is. Just got the
Yeah.
color. I can see the color scheme from here.
See the colors. Yep. Yeah. So, as we wrap this conversation up, before we get to our last segment, anything else that you want to share about the nervous system generally, or as it relates to religious trauma or healing, anything that you want our listeners to know?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing, I probably said this before, I don't remember, but it's just be patient with yourself.
Yeah.
Be patient
Hmm.
with yourself. It's one of those things where even now, like we've said
Hmm.
what we've said on this podcast today, and it's easy to kind of have this moment of, oh my gosh, like holy shit, it's making sense now. I understand now why
Hmm.
things maybe weren't falling into place the way I hoped they would
Yeah.
when I maybe started therapy 5 years ago or whatever. And like this is like
Yeah.
that key.
Yeah.
But then still having that patience and realizing just because you have that cognitive awareness, it still takes time because that's
Hmm.
literally the
Hmm.
nature of how it is with our
Hmm.
bodies and with our nervous systems.
Yeah.
So again,
Yeah.
full circle, just patience,
Hmm.
self-compassion,
Yeah.
like self-kindness. I cannot
Yeah.
emphasize those enough.
Hmm. Yeah. And I would literally just say ditto. That's, if I agree, be patient, be kind. This is hard work we're doing. It will pay off, but when we go slow, then we get to go fast,
Mhm.
eventually.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this is a great conversation and look forward to having more. Okay. We are going to be taking back Sundays. So, this is the part of our episode where we talk about what we are reclaiming. And so, Andrew, I'm just curious to know from you, what are you taking back?
So, this is something that's been on my mind lately. I'm not sure exactly what exactly I'm taking back here, but I mean, it makes sense once I talk about it, I think. And that is, in a couple of weeks, will actually be going to an Adventist camp meeting for the first time in 5 years.
Wow.
I feel like I need to preface that when I say I'm going to an Adventist camp meeting, my family is going to be there, my parents, and then the two
Mm.
living grandparents that I still have will both be there. And it's hard to logistically see all of
Hmm.
them with any real frequency. So
Yeah.
I am not going because of camp meeting. It's just that's the geographical location at which they will
Yeah.
be, and therefore I'm going to see them. But it'll be in the context of Carolina camp meeting over here at Lake
Yeah.
Junaluska, North Carolina. That's where the Carolina Conference of Seventh-day Adventists has their annual camp meeting. It's Memorial Day week every year, and there are a lot of memories going to that with my family. I mean, since the summer of '94, I think,
Mm.
or '93, maybe. It's been many years, and I do have a lot of memories there. And I also,
Mm.
a lot of good memories, a lot of not so great memories, and it
Hmm.
carries a lot of
Yeah.
baggage. And I wasn't really planning on going. It's just kind of everything aligned. My
Yeah.
grandparents were all going to be there. So I'm like, oh, what the hell? I'll go. And interestingly enough, granted, I'm not there yet physically, but right now I'm actually okay with it. I'm really not even
Mm.
concerned or nervous or feeling like, oh shit, what did I get myself into? Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, I probably would have been feeling that a little
Mm.
more. Maybe but the thing is, there was a lot of things that I do enjoy about being there. Just I like the
Mm.
where it's at, and
Yeah.
it's near Asheville, North Carolina. My dad and I ride motorcycles there, like just in the mountains in that area. The Blue
Wow.
Ridge Parkway is right there. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that I'm kind of reclaiming and being able to do so without the baggage of Adventism dragging along with me. Like that
Yeah.
you can have your
Sure.
camp meeting. I don't need your camp meeting. I don't
Mm.
feel like I need to hate your camp meeting. I'm just ambivalent. I'm just going to live my life
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
see my family. So
Ah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I love that. That's so interesting because, like, literally, mine is along those same lines of what am I taking back? I had shared that obviously I grew up at a camp. And so
Yes.
lots of camp stuff, retreats, all the things. I went to all the youth retreats because I was a youth leader and all these things. And I have really, really struggled with like large group activities like that in settings where we're all living together and, communing. It's been very triggering for me to be a part of those just because of how closely that mirrored my former life and the isolation pieces. And this year, some of my colleagues and I, and we decided to host a booth at the Wild Goose Festival that's coming up here in a few weeks. And it is a bit of that atmosphere, right? Camping, and we're all together, and there's music and speakers and like all the things that I grew up with. And there's part of me that's very tentative of like, oh, I don't want to touch that, not even with a 10-foot pole. And then this other side of me that goes, yeah, but this is different, right? There's choice. I'm not going to stay on the campgrounds. I can drive, I can leave, I can, I have friends, people that I trust that are also going. I have so many people that I'm looking forward to meeting. Maybe some of you listening, you'll be there as well. And so that idea of like reclaiming community and group activity, like communal group stuff that like all having similar shared purpose and those sorts of things. I'm nervous, but I'm also excited. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. I'll have to report back. Yeah.
Yeah. No, there are a
Yeah.
lot of similarities. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing. And yeah, thank you to everybody for listening. We're excited for you to come back in our next episode. And any final words of wisdom, Andrew?
Yeah, I feel like we really covered so much. I don't know that I
Yeah,
have anything else to really add to other than just,
that's okay.
all about
Yeah.
that curiosity and compassion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Stay curious, people.